My cold, impossible father made me feel like I was never enough. Until after his funeral, I found the secret notebook proving he tracked every fear, every failure, and loved me the whole time. My name is Daniel. I'm 34 years old, and until the day we buried my father, I would have described him with 3 words: cold, strict, and impossible. He wasn't the kind of dad who hugged you after a bad day. He wasn't the kind who asked how you were feeling. He was the kind who stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and asked why your math grade dropped from AB to AC. When I was 10, I brought home a drawing from school because my teacher said it was the best in class. My mom smiled, taped it to the fridge, and kissed the top of my head. My father looked at it for maybe 2 seconds and said, "That's nice. Did you finish your science worksheet?" That was him. Everything with him felt like a test I was already failing. If I won something, he'd ask what came next. If I struggled, he'd ask why I hadn't prepared better. If I got upset, he'd tell me life didn't care about excuses. I learned early that softness lived with my mother. Standards lived with my father. And standards were loud. By middle school, I had developed a knot in my stomach that appeared every time I heard his car pull into the driveway. I knew the rhythm of his footsteps. I knew the sound of him putting his keys in the bowl near the door. I knew exactly how long it took him to notice if I was pretending to do homework. He never hit me, never screamed like some fathers do. Honestly, that almost made it worse. He just looked at me with disappointment, so sharp it felt surgical. When I was 14, I bombed an algebra test. I still remember sitting at the kitchen table, watching him study the paper like it was a crime scene. 82, he said. I stared at the table. It was a hard test. He slid it back toward me. It was a test other kids passed. That sentence stayed with me for years. Other kids passed. Other kids were enough. Other kids probably had fathers who knew how to talk to them without making them feel small. The older I got, the less I tried. Not with school. I still did well, because fear is a pretty effective tutor, but with him, I stopped telling him things. Stopped expecting warmth. Stopped looking for approval that never came. By the time I left for college, we had perfected our relationship into something efficient and bloodless. We talked about deadlines, jobs, rent, practical things. Never feelings. Never fear. Never love. And then, 6 weeks ago, he died of a heart attack before sunrise. Quick, the doctor said. Peaceful, people said. But there was nothing peaceful about standing in his house afterward, surrounded by shoes he would never wear again, trying to understand how a man could dominate your whole childhood and still leave behind so many unanswered questions. I thought I was there to help my mother clean out his office. I had no idea I was about to find out who my father really was. My father's office was the one room in the house nobody touched. Even when I was a kid, it felt less like a room and more like a border checkpoint. Everything had a place. Pens lined up parallel on his desk. Bills stacked by date. Books arranged by height, then subject, because apparently alphabetizing alone was too reckless for him. 3 days after the funeral, my mother asked if I could help box things up. She said it casually, but her eyes were swollen and tired. Grief had turned her voice thin. I can't do his office yet, she told me. You always understood his system better than I did. That almost made me laugh. I hadn't understood my father in 20 years. But I said yes. At first it was exactly what I expected. File folders, tax returns, warranty papers for appliances we didn't even own anymore. A museum of boring, practical survival. I spent 2 hours sorting receipts and old insurance documents, getting more annoyed the longer I sat in his chair. Because even dead, he was still making me do homework. Then I found the notebook. It wasn't hidden dramatically in a safe or tucked beneath floorboards. It was in the bottom drawer of his desk, under a stack of manuals, plain and dark blue, the kind you buy in a 3-pack at an office supply store. No label, no title. I almost tossed it into the donation pile. But when I opened it, the first page stopped me cold. Daniel, grade 3. Under that, in my father's handwriting. Reading level strong. Math confidence lower than ability. Gets frustrated when he knows the answer, but can't explain it fast enough. Need better way to help without embarrassing him. I just stared at it. Then I turned the page. Spoke to Mrs. Hensley after school. She says he rushes when nervous and checks the room to see if others are finished. Must teach him that panic makes him sloppy. Maybe practice time quizzes at home, but keep it light. Don't let him think he's failing. I sat down slowly. There were more pages. So many more. Each one had a date. My age. My grade. Notes about school, friends, teachers, soccer practice, science fairs, dentist appointments. Even the week in 7th grade when I faked being sick because a group of boys had been making fun of me. I never told him the real reason I stayed home that week. But there it was, in ink. Something happened at school. He says stomachache, but he won't look me in the eye. Call counselor quietly. Do not push him tonight. He shuts down when cornered. I felt this strange pressure in my chest. Because this wasn't the father I remembered. The father I remembered noticed mistakes, not moods. He corrected outcomes, not feelings. He definitely did not write private observations like he shuts down when cornered. That sounded like someone who had been paying very, very close attention. A knock at the door made me jump. My mother leaned in. "You okay?" I looked up too fast. "Yeah. Why?" "You've been in here a while." I glanced back at the notebook, suddenly weirdly protective of it. "Just sorting." She nodded, but before leaving, she said something that made the room tilt. "You know," she said softly, "your father used to sit in here at night after you went to bed. For hours." Then she walked away, and I looked back down at the page in my lap, realizing those hours had not been about paperwork. They had been about me. I took the notebook home that night without telling my mother. Not because I wanted to hide it from her. I just needed it to be mine for a little while. Needed to read it somewhere quiet, somewhere I could react without anyone seeing my face. I sat at my kitchen table until almost 2 in the morning, turning pages with the kind of carefulness people usually reserve for old photographs. The note started when I was 8. The handwriting was firmer in the early years, tighter, almost mechanical. Very much my father. Bullet points, observations, plans. But as I kept reading, something else emerged. Patterns. He tracked my grades, yes, but not like a tyrant building a case. More like a man trying to solve a puzzle without letting the puzzle know it was being studied. One entry from 4th grade read, "Multiplication tables still weak. He knows them at home, freezes at school. Practice in car rides. Make it a game so he doesn't feel tested." Another, "Asked librarian for books on attention and learning frustration. He is not lazy. He spirals when he believes he's behind. Important difference." I had to stop after that line. I read it again, then again. "He is not lazy. Do you know how many years I spent believing my father thought exactly that about me? Lazy, weak, too sensitive, too emotional, not disciplined enough." And yet here, in private, where he had no audience and no reason to perform, he had written the opposite. There were notes about my teachers. Mr. Avery praises high performers publicly. Bad for Daniel. He withdraws when singled out. Mrs. Kent says he helps other students once he understands material. Good sign. Confidence comes after mastery, not before. There were notes about my friends. Ethan is good for him. Brings him out of his shell. Invite over more. Concern about Tyler. Daniel laughs harder around him than usual. Looks like trying to earn approval. Watch this. Tyler had been the first friend who made me feel like acceptance had to be bought. I didn't even understand that about myself until years later. My father had clocked it immediately. The worst part, the part that really got under my skin, was that some entries described moments I remembered as proof he didn't care. Like the 8th grade science competition. I had spent weeks building this awful little volcano model, and when I placed second, my mom hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack. My father only said, "Next time, label your data table more clearly." I hated him for that. I hated him all weekend. But in the notebook, under that date, he had written, "Second place." He looked for me in the crowd before results were announced. Need to remember that. He still wants my approval even when he acts angry. Told him about data table because praise embarrasses him in public at this age. May have chosen wrong. His face fell. I keep getting that part wrong. I pushed back from the table, so suddenly my chair scraped the floor. Because that was it, wasn't it? He knew. He knew he was getting it wrong. Not all of it. Maybe not even most of it. But enough to write it down in private, like a confession no one was supposed to hear. I sat there in the dim kitchen light, one hand over my mouth, trying to reconcile 2 versions of the same man. The father who made my childhood feel like performance review after performance review. And the father who wrote, in careful ink, he looked for me in the crowd. Need to remember that. That was the first night I cried for him. Not because he was gone. Because for the first time, I realized I might never get to ask him why he loved me like a man guarding a secret. The next night, I read the section covering high school. And that's where the notebook stopped feeling like a surprise and started feeling like a wrecking ball. Because high school was when I decided my father and I would never really know each other. That was the era of slammed doors, clenched jaws, clipped conversations. The era where every talk turned into a fight, and every fight turned into silence. I was moody, insecure, angry at the world, and he responded to all of it like he was managing a failing employee. At least, that's how it felt. But the notebook told a different story. Age 15. Teachers say he's capable of more than he submits. Neat approach that doesn't sound like criticism. He hears concern as disappointment. That line sat in my chest like a stone. Because he was right. That is exactly what I heard. Not concern. Not worry. Not fear for my future. Disappointment. Every single time. Then came pages about my sophomore year. The worst year. My grades slipped. I quit soccer. I barely slept. I started eating lunch in the art room because it was quieter than the cafeteria. At home I got sarcastic and mean, and my father got stricter which only made me worse. I thought he saw me as a problem. Instead, the notebook said, "Something is off. He is not defiant. He is exhausted. Eyes red in mornings. Ask doctor about sleep, but do not make him feel watched." Another entry. Found crumpled quiz in trash. 67. He hid it. Not because he doesn't care, because he does. Too much. And then, one line that absolutely broke me. He thinks I only notice when he fails. Need to fix this. Still don't know how to talk to him without making him brace for impact. I put the notebook down and just stared at the wall. Because that was the whole tragedy right there. I spent my childhood convinced my father didn't understand me. Meanwhile, he had understood one devastating thing perfectly, that I expected pain the second he opened his mouth. He knew I braced for him. And somehow, even knowing that, he still couldn't bridge the gap. There were also practical notes, plans, lists, actual strategies. Call math tutor, but ask her not to mention I arranged it. He'll refuse if he thinks it means he's failing. College savings on track. Keep extra for SAT prep if needed. Speak to guidance office about AP options. He does better when challenged privately than praised publicly. I laughed at that one through tears. It was such a specific, weirdly accurate thing to know about someone. And it hit me then. My father had not just been watching my life from a distance. He had been studying it, adjusting around it, quietly building scaffolding under me where I'd never notice. Not gracefully, not tenderly, not in a way that felt good, but constantly. Near the back of that section, folded between 2 pages, I found a yellowing slip of paper from my 11th grade report card envelope. On the back, in his handwriting, was a list. Ways to help Daniel without pushing him away. Ask fewer questions at once. Correct in private. Don't compare him to anyone. When he gets angry, don't match it. Remember, he is harder on himself than I am. I read that last line 3 times. Because my father, the man I had spent half my life resenting for being impossibly hard on me, had apparently known all along that the cruelest voice in my life was already my own. And he had been trying, in his awkward, rigid, maddening way, not to become louder than it. By the 5th day, I wasn't just reading the notebook. I was interrogating my entire childhood. Memories I had carried like evidence started changing shape in my hands. Like the parent-teacher conference in 10th grade. I remembered sitting in the car afterward, staring out the window while my father drove in silence. I had gotten a comment from one teacher that said I was bright but inconsistent, and I knew that phrase would live in the house for weeks. Finally, at a red light, my father said, "Potential doesn't matter if you don't use it." I remember the exact burn of those words. What I didn't remember, because at the time it had seemed too small to matter, was that he had stopped at my favorite burger place on the way home and handed me a bag without comment. I ate in silence, assuming it was guilt or habit or convenience. In the notebook, that same day read, "Conference worse than expected. English teacher used phrase, wasting potential. Should not have repeated it in the car." His shoulders shut down immediately. Bought him food because he hadn't eaten. Need to learn that advice lands badly when he's ashamed. That was the rhythm of the notebook. Not perfection. Awareness. Regret. Adjustment. My father kept making emotional mistakes, and then writing himself instructions like he was trying to build a manual for loving his own son. And maybe that's what it was. Maybe some men inherit tenderness naturally. Mine apparently had to reverse engineer it in secret. Then I hit the pages from senior year, and everything got even heavier. That was the year I got into 3 colleges and didn't tell him for 2 days because I wanted to tell my mother first. She cried when she found out. My father shook my hand. Actually shook my hand. I was 18, and he shook my hand like I'd closed a business deal. I joked about it with friends afterward, but it hurt. It hurt more than I admitted. In the notebook, under that week, he had written, he got accepted, wanted to hug him. Shook his hand instead like an idiot. Why is that the move my body keeps choosing? My father would have done less. That is not an excuse. I covered my eyes with my palm. Because suddenly my father wasn't just a father anymore. He was a son, a man with his own history, a man shaped by someone before him. I had never thought much about my grandfather beyond the obvious facts. Stern, military, emotionally constipated, dead before I was born. Family lore painted him as hard and distant, and I had always assumed my father had simply become a polished version of the same machine. But that note suggested something worse. Not that my father had learned coldness, that he had been fighting it, and losing, sometimes. A few pages later, I found college expense calculations, scholarship estimates, housing comparisons, and a line underlined twice. Do not let him give up school because of money if I can prevent it. Pride is expensive, debt is worse. He paid more of my tuition than I knew. I knew he helped. I didn't know he'd reworked their whole budget to make it happen. There were notes about overtime shifts, delayed home repairs, even postponing a car replacement. I sat there with tears dripping off my chin onto paper he never expected me to read. And for the first time in my life, I understood something terrifying. My father had loved me in thousands of practical, hidden, unspectacular ways I had never counted because none of them sounded like, "I love you." And when you grow up hungry for warmth, you don't always recognize devotion when it's wearing work boots and saying the wrong thing. The notebook should have ended there, and honestly, that would have been enough to undo me. But it didn't, because tucked in the back cover was a smaller stack of loose pages, folded in half and dated after I moved out. That's when the third twist hit me. My father hadn't stopped writing when I became an adult. He had kept going. There were notes from my college years. "Daniel called tonight. Tried to sound casual, but I think he's overwhelmed. Midterms maybe. Must resist urge to lecture. He called, that matters. He said he's thinking of changing majors. Don't push stability too hard. He lights up when he talks about design. Fear is mine, not his." That one gutted me because I remembered that conversation. I had expected a fight when I switched from business to architecture. Instead, my father had just gone quiet for a moment and said, "Then be serious about it." I took that as disapproval. Now I knew it had actually been restraint. More pages. Graduation next month. Need to tell him I'm proud of him without making it sound formal. Practice on drive there. Ridiculous to rehearse one sentence, but here we are. I laughed out loud at that, and then cried again, which was becoming an exhausting pattern. Because at graduation he had, in fact, sounded formal. He'd clapped my shoulder and said, "You finished what you started. Good." I had spent 12 years being angry about that sentence. Apparently, that had been the improved version. Then came notes from my first apartment, my first promotion, even my breakup with the woman I thought I'd marry when I was 29. I never told him much about that breakup. I told my mother I was fine. And somehow he still wrote. He came by for dinner and talked too much. Sign he's covering. Eyes tired. Wanted to ask if she heard him or if he left first. Said nothing. Wrong choice. Maybe just let him keep dignity. My God. He noticed everything. Not loudly. Not beautifully. Not in a way that made you feel held. But relentlessly. Every stage of my life I had thought I was walking mostly alone. My father had apparently been tracking from the edge of the map with terrible emotional vocabulary and astonishing attention to detail. Then I found the page that finally made me put the notebook down and leave the room. It was dated only 8 months before he died. Daniel, age 33. Still rubs the back of his neck when anxious. Still tries to make jokes when something matters too much. Good man. Kinder than I was at his age. Smarter too, though he still doubts it. I wish I had made home feel softer for him. He was a sensitive boy. Nothing wrong with that. I treated it like something to toughen out of him. That may be my great failure. I just stood up and walked to the sink because I couldn't breathe. A grown man, shaking over a notebook. Because there it was. The apology I was never going to get in person. Not polished. Not spoken. But real. And worse than that, beautiful. He knew. He knew exactly where he had failed me. And he had carried that knowledge quietly, all the way to the end. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept reading, then pacing, then rereading. Like maybe if I stared at the words long enough, they'd turn into a version of my father I could still call. Instead, all I had were pages. Pages, and the sickening realization that grief gets more complicated when the dead suddenly become easier to love. I started remembering things differently. Not inventing memories. Reframing them. Like how my father always seemed to know when parent registration deadlines were coming up, or when school projects needed supplies, or when I was pretending I didn't care about something that clearly mattered to me. I used to think that was just parental surveillance. Control. Now I wondered how much of it came from observation so constant it bordered on devotion. Then I found one of the hardest entries in the whole notebook. It was from when I was 16, after a brutal fight we had about a history paper. I had yelled that he didn't know anything about me. He had told me to stop being dramatic. I slammed my bedroom door so hard a framed photo fell off the wall outside. I remember lying on my bed afterward, furious, thinking, one day I'll leave and he won't even notice. In the notebook, that same night. Big fight. He said I don't know him. He is partly right. I know his patterns, but not enough of his inner life because every time I try, I sound like criticism. He looked hurt before he looked angry. Important. Don't forget that sequence. That line haunted me. He looked hurt before he looked angry. My father had seen it. He had seen the wound underneath the attitude. He just hadn't known how to reach it. And then came another pattern I hadn't expected. He often wrote down things he wanted to say to me and apparently never did. Tell him rest is not laziness. Tell him being gentle does not make him weak. Tell him I notice how kind he is to his mother. Tell him I brag about him at work more than he'd believe. That last one wrecked me in a fresh way because I flashed back to being 12, overhearing him on the phone in the garage. He was talking to some coworker, and I distinctly heard my name. I paused near the door, waiting. He said, "Yeah, he's doing all right. That's all." I walked away crushed. Now I found a note from that same week. Told Frank at work Daniel did well on his presentation and handled nerves better than most adults. Realized later Daniel was nearby. If he heard only the last part of the conversation, he probably thinks I minimized it. Again. That word kept appearing. Again. Like he lived with an ongoing tally of all the ways love kept slipping through his fingers before it reached me. By then I understood something I wish I'd understood while he was alive. My father wasn't emotionless. He was emotionally trapped. And those are not the same thing. One is absence. The other is imprisonment. He had spent my entire life trying to care for me through structure, problem-solving, provision, planning, observation, because those were the only emotional languages he trusted himself to speak. He built bridges out of wood and rules and money and logistics. I just kept waiting for one made of words. A week after I found the notebook, I went back to my mother's house and asked her a question I should have asked years ago. What was Grandpa like with Dad? She was standing at the counter peeling carrots for dinner, and she didn't even look surprised. She just exhaled. Hard, she said. Hard in the way people used to call respectable. Then she set the peeler down and finally met my eyes. Your father was scared of disappointing him until the day that man died. That landed heavily. I told her about the notebook then. Not all of it. Just enough. At first she covered her mouth like she couldn't believe I'd found it. Then her eyes filled. He kept that thing for years, she said. He thought I didn't know. You knew? Not what was in it. Just that he wrote in it after you went to bed. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table. Daniel, your father worried about you constantly. I laughed once, bitter and stunned. That is not how he made it feel. I know, she said, and there was pain in that answer too. I used to fight with him about that. I'd tell him, he needs warmth, not management. And your father would say, I'm trying to help him become steady. She wiped at one eye. He thought if he made you strong enough, life couldn't crush you. That sounded exactly like him. Tragic, logical, wrong. I pulled the notebook from my bag and showed her a few pages. Not the most private ones. Not the lines that felt like they belonged to me alone. But enough. She cried almost immediately. Not loud crying. The kind that just leaks out because grief recognizes itself in handwriting. Then she said something that stayed with me. Your father loved with fear. I frowned. What does that mean? It means every loving thought in him came out wearing armor. That was it. That was my entire childhood. Love wearing armor looks a lot like distance when you're a kid. It looks like correction instead of comfort. It looks like plans instead of praise. It looks like someone teaching you to brace for impact because they think bracing is the same as preparing. My mother rested a hand over the notebook. He was so proud of you. I swallowed hard. He could have said that. Yes, she said quietly. He could have. And he should have. No excuses. No cleaning it up. No pretending the damage didn't matter. That helped, weirdly, because discovering the notebook didn't erase what my childhood felt like. It didn't magically transform fear into security. It didn't make his silences harmless. But it did change the story. I had spent decades believing I was raised by a man who saw me as a project. Now I knew I had been raised by a man who loved me deeply, worried about me constantly, and lacked the emotional tools to make that love feel safe. That doesn't undo pain, but it does make room for mercy. The last page in the notebook wasn't really a note. It was more like a fragment. No date, just handwriting slightly shakier than the earlier entries. I almost missed it because it had been tucked into the inside back pocket. It said, if anything happens to me before I say this properly, he was always enough. I mistook pressure for preparation too many times. If he ever reads this, I hope he knows I noticed everything. Not because I was judging him, because I loved him. I loved being his father. I was just worse at showing it than he deserved. I don't know how long I sat there after reading that. There are some sentences that don't enter your mind so much as detonate inside it. He was always enough. That was the sentence I had needed at 10, at 14, at 18, at 25, at 30. That was the sentence under every fight, every report card, every stiff car ride, every correction I mistook for contempt. And now I had it. Too late to answer. Too late to ask questions. Too late to watch his face while he said it. But not too late, apparently, to let it change me. I took that page to my apartment and put it on my desk for 3 days. I just kept looking at it like it might disappear if I blinked wrong. Then I did something I never thought I'd do. I went to the cemetery alone. No flowers. My father wouldn't have cared about flowers. Just the notebook in my backpack and a stupid amount of nervousness, as if I were about to have the first honest conversation of our lives and was somehow still worried I'd say the wrong thing. I stood there in the cold for a long time before speaking. You really made this harder than it had to be, I said. And then I laughed, because he would have agreed with that. I told him I was angry, that I wished he'd figured it out sooner, that I wished he'd said the quiet things out loud, that I wished my childhood had felt less like being sharpened and more like being loved. Then I told him I knew now. Not everything. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to stop carrying him as a villain in every memory. Enough to understand that some of the men we resent most are the ones who were trying badly, not trying at all. Enough to say, through tears I absolutely did not want to be having in a cemetery. I know you loved me. And maybe the strangest part was this. For the first time in my life, saying that didn't feel like making excuses for him. It felt like telling the truth. I still wish my father had been softer. That's the honest ending, not the neat one. I wish he had hugged me more. I wish he had praised me before correcting me. I wish he had said, "I'm proud of you," without rehearsing it privately in a notebook he never intended me to see. I wish my childhood had felt warmer from the inside, not just understandable in hindsight. But I don't think reevaluating your childhood means lying about it. It means widening it. It means admitting that the man I remembered was real, the strict, distant father who made me feel judged. But the man in the notebook was also real, the one who tracked my struggles at school, made plans to help me study without humiliating me, worried over my anxiety, noticed my bad friendships, protected my tuition, regretted his mistakes, and followed every stage of my life with an attention so constant it now feels almost holy. Both men were my father. And maybe maturity is realizing people can fail you and love you at the same time. I used to think my childhood was defined by what I didn't get from him. Now, when I look back, I see something more complicated. I see a man built by hardness, trying to raise a sensitive son without passing on all the damage and only half succeeding. I see a father who didn't know how to show emotion, so he turned love into planning, into monitoring, into solving, into staying up late writing notes about my teachers, my grades, my fears, my future. I see a man who got the tone wrong over and over again, but never stopped paying attention. And somehow that changes everything. Not because it erases the ache, because it gives the ache a different meaning. I was not invisible to him. I was never invisible. All those years I thought he only saw my mistakes. He was seeing all of me. The panic, the effort, the shame, the kindness, the ambition, the sensitivity I spent years trying to hide because I thought he hated it. Turns out he noticed that too. Turns out he even blamed himself for making me think it was weakness. So this is where I've landed. My father was not the man I thought he was. He was more flawed than I knew, and more loving than I ever imagined. And now when I remember him standing in my bedroom doorway, arms crossed, asking whether I'd finished my work, I don't just hear criticism anymore. I hear the clumsy language of a man trying to prepare his son for a life he feared would be hard. I hear concern wearing the wrong coat. I hear love in a voice that didn't know how to sound gentle. And for the first time in my life, when I think of my father, I don't feel that old knot in my stomach. I feel grief. I feel tenderness. And, beneath both of them, something I never thought I'd be able to give him. Forgiveness. If you want, I can also turn this into a more dramatic YouTube-ready narration script with stronger cliffhangers at the end of each part.